The Afterdeath Journal of an American Philosopher by Jane Roberts. And this is a continuation of Chapter 1. And this is Friday morning, January 28th, 1977. And this is William James speaking. One of our errors was in regarding the intellect alone as capable of judgments and as the final arbiter of events. Feelings and sentiments can be used, also should be used, for the emotions make their own judgments of reality, and it is against those more volatile opinions that we ultimately assess our acts. That is, the emotions also provide a legitimate, though different framework with which to test the results of any event, paranormal or otherwise, and the emotion's truth may respond to an inner objective reality that has its own rules and values that are not mysterious or hidden, but perceivable if you use the proper measuring tool. Such a proposition is most difficult to defend intellectually, yet there are some analogies to be found. A novel can be true in the deepest sense, for example, though the details within it are quite false in scientific terms, if the places and the people mentioned therein do not exist in fact. The scientist, judging such a work by the rules of his own discipline alone, might indeed entirely dismiss the dimensions of the artistic, creative world, or dismiss such works as beneath serious adult consideration. The fictional events of the novel are symbolic statements about inner emotional realities that have deep validity. There is a definite correspondence between such imaginative events and the objective world. The trouble is, of course, that this correspondence is not measurable in usual terms. To dismiss it for that reason, however, would be to rob the world of its invaluable artistic heritage and accomplishment. While I became in life more and more disillusioned with the results of paranormal investigations, therefore I became in time more and more convinced that the fictionalized events of many seance rooms, those spooky dramas, formed of desperate hopes, emotional frenzies, creative fabrications, and subconscious dramatizations, those morality plays in miniature occurring in neighborhood after neighborhood, stood for inner realities. They symbolized inner facts, if you prefer, even when they were fraudulent, and held the same correspondence to events after death as conventional novels or plays did to daily life. We could compare the works of art to the events they symbolized, but the reality of the afterlife presents us in life with no ready yardstick with which to measure what truths or inner facts reside in the seance or other such psychological events. The seance is, however, a social event in that there are participants, an audience sometimes, and we are faced by the same problems that witnesses provide whenever they are expected to state clearly the bare facts of their experience. Such are the powers of the creative imagination that such participants may, in fact, that is, physically, perceive the fictionalized events, may actually see the apparition under the suggestion of the medium in a psychological drama in which the medium herself is convinced of the apparition's appearance, because, like the scientist perhaps, she trusts the evidence of her own senses. And those senses might indeed show her the shadowy image of a person, the deceased, clearly positioned. She may hear words which she repeats for the sitter, taking it for granted that no fraud exists in such a hypothetical case. What are we to say? We must say that we do not understand perception itself. So I told myself. More of this later. But if we look at that seance as a creative, dramatic, psychological event, we can at least compare it to other more conventional dramas, such as religious or artistic productions and ceremonies. We have, for example, a set of conventions, and a loose cast of characters, the Indian guides, doctors, philosophers, poets, and other personae, and the denizens of the dead, in other words, who serve as controls or mediators between the medium and the deceased. Perhaps these are artificial productions, fictionalized characters, coming to life, so to speak, through the medium's gestures, voices, and actions, instead of simply appearing on the printed page as the main characters of a novelistic art. Or perhaps this also represents a kind of creative synthesis with which we are usually unfamiliar, a psychological reorientation that allows the medium to tune into a different perceptive environment, which is then interpreted in terms that we do not understand. Again, so I told myself, I wondered if the theater productions of the actor's world stand for the objective reality, then what is behind the seance's creative drama? Is the medium's experience a symbolic role-playing, I asked, that tries to depict through personification a definite alteration of consciousness that does in fact occur after death? I must profess that those seances I attended in life were far from quality artistic productions, however, and those performances that came under the guise of art, such as automatic writing, gave little evidence of creative merit. I found primitive art charming, but such primitive gropings with the written word embarrassed me to the core. At least, such was my own reaction to those manuscripts that came to my attention. There were also, however, more cultivated ladies from sheltered environments who held their seances in the tasteful parlors of the well-to-do, amid rich wall hangings, with maids serving tea and cakes, parlors visited by quite educated men of letters, women whose honesty and sincerity were beyond doubt. Here the setting was more proper, the rapport between the medium and the investigator far more comfortable. Current news and gossip might be discussed before the curtains drawn. But in their anxiousness to prove their cases, such ladies often produced only a more stately version of events, with which the investigators were already familiar, a more cultivated package perhaps, but with more content. These more respectable ladies regulated their own emotional tones, perhaps automatically, in response to the investigator's distrust of sentiment, trying to be even more reasonable, more logical, so that the results of their intuitive experiments would be favorably received. This was a pity, for such attempts worked counter to whatever abilities the ladies possessed. Paranormal events, however, had been labeled in such a way, often by psychologists themselves, that the incidence of them carried the tinge of unrespectability at best, and at the worst implied the most dangerous kind of hysteria. Experiments by psychologists in hypnosis deepened those connections by producing, through suggestion, acting upon hypnotist and subject alike, those results that were expected. So-called split personalities were psychologically manufactured by such dallyings, tailored to fit the hypnotist's preconceptions. A good hypnotist automatically hypnotizes himself before he begins to work his suggestions upon the mind of another, a fact not in the least understood then or now. Nor did the true scientist dare allow himself to experience paranormal events, generally speaking, for to do so would put him into the same kettle, bringing him to question those qualities of objectivity, intellectual discrimination, and emotional balance that he believed separated him from those that he studied. The more such a man tried to dismiss his emotions, to retain an objective stance, the more his emotional needs strained at the academic leash, and the more he became fascinated by the emotional elements under investigation, the greater his risks of losing his psychic virginity. Okay, so the next short session here was from Friday afternoon, January 28, 1977, and William James continues here. Exploring the frontiers of the mind was more than a metaphor. The optimistic, aggressive, democratic march was to extend not only across the continent, but to the very soul of the country. Unfortunately, the techniques that fostered industry and emerging technologies were not those that best encouraged the research into man's mind. For one thing, the mind was to be harnessed, directed, focused in order to help man in his battle against nature and against what he saw as the unreasonable, savage impulses of his own nature. At the same time, the highest ideals of democracy were often pursued with brawling indifference to the needs of others, with a disregard for sentiment, except when it met national or patriotic needs. Those needs were largely understood in terms of Protestantism, interpreted according to American interests. Godliness meant social works, but in a no-dallying manner, and God helped those who helped themselves. To this end, the psychologist tried to retain a crisp manner, a clear-cut optimism, a scientific stance, that all in all stood for no nonsense, except, of course, that perpetuated in psychology's name. In this general atmosphere, it seemed safest to me to concentrate my efforts in theory rather than in practice, and to serve as a messenger of sorts between men working in the field, so to speak, and their colleagues in the universities. I also settled upon certain other refinements dictated certainly by the characteristics of my own temperament. That temperament, while attracted by the hurly-burly, the rambunctiousness of its time, by the demonic spirit in action, was also aristocratic, withdrawn, one might say queasy, at the overrich diet of democratic comradeship, and also tinged by an almost constant melancholy. For a scientist, I was overly aware of my own states of mind, overly preoccupied with my moods, yet I was too critically attuned, too skeptical of the emotions to give them sway, and so lacked the emotional energy of the artists. No coincidence, then, that I settled upon a critical analysis of states of mind, the intellectual investigation of religious inspirations, the sometimes gloomy pursuit of a man's triumphant spirit in death, since in life that triumph eluded me so steadily. Had I tied these two characteristics of mine together, I could have ridden emotion's power into the highest states of creativity, at least to the best of my ability, and at the same time given my intellect a creative freedom, forming a synthesis that I know now should be the natural state of man's psyche. In an understanding of man's creative forces and of the tension between intellect and emotions can be found those far elusive clues to the powers of the psyche that do indeed allow it to continue its existence after death, although in an altered state of consciousness and in an environment that bears the same relationship to physical life as physical life does to the theater production, while combining the most creative elements of each. And that concludes that section. Oh, That was so interesting. And the next section of this chapter, it's that short section, and I'll read it now. This is Jane Roberts, musing on things. After my writing for that day was finished, I decided to do some sketching for a change of pace. Suddenly I found myself involved in a new kind of experience, the first of many in which the James of my subjective experience reached out beyond his manuscript in one way or another. This particular incident happened quite unexpectedly. I was sitting at the living room table, and I had just opened my sketch pad. In the next moment, in my mind's eye, I saw a man seated in a study. I was sure that this was William James, but I wasn't sure whether I was seeing a portrait of James or an actual image of him in a chair. In any case, I drew what I saw, though not too expertly. I am quite poor at perspective and in handling the proportions of the human figure. Instantly, as soon as I was done, I saw 3 framed oil paintings, 2 landscapes, and a seascape. And I felt that these had once hung in James's study. The images were fairly steady. I knew I was supposed to duplicate them. I don't work in oils much at all, so I grabbed my acrylics and tried to reproduce the paintings. They were entirely different from anything I'd done before, in just about every way. Color choice, mood, and composition. I was quite exhilarated, yet frustrated. It was really difficult to translate inspiration into a medium in which you aren't proficient. When I was done, I kept staring at my amateur work, comparing the paintings with those I saw in my mind. The mental ones were heavily painted and reminded me of old paintings that I'd seen long ago in an art gallery, American landscapes of the 19th century, moody, featuring great trees blowing in the wind, skies lashed by storm clouds, and beneath, virgin romantic forests. Did my attempts represent paintings that had once hung in James' study? I'll probably never know, but I won't forget that evening when I painted so frantically and felt so close to James's surroundings in his life. Did the portrait bear any resemblance to James? I didn't know that either. It showed a man with dark hair and a beard facing the foreground. I just sighed and put the sketches away. I was somewhat bewildered, though, by the connection between James and my painting. Since, I mentioned, I felt no interaction when I was doing the Paul Cézanne script. Several months later, however, in a national magazine, I read that James was an amateur artist. That was news to me, and certainly implied that James was interested in art and may have had original paintings on his walls. Perhaps his amateur status made him sympathetic to my own painting efforts. Our interest in art may have served as another link between us, though primarily one that is obviously verbal. And that concludes chapter 1. Oh, that was so interesting. Okay, chapter 2 is entitled Depression, Precognition, and the Dynamics of Creativity. And I hope you're enjoying this. And as I'm reading it for YouTube right now, click on like and subscribe and leave a comment. That would help me out greatly in creating this small spiritual channel. Yes, and tell me, I have... I'm going to go into a little personal stuff now, and you don't have to listen. This isn't really, truly relevant to the book that I'm reading. So if you want to listen, fine. But, you can click off now and come back when I read chapter 2. But I'll just tell you a little bit about myself. I'm a hypnotherapist, but I'm a scientist by background. You know, I've studied science. I have a degree in science. And the fact that she sees, or she saw rather, because Jane has now passed, she saw James sitting there. This has happened to me too, that I've seen people who seemed very real, you know, but in my experience, when I've seen them, not only did they seem very real, and the image of them stayed for a long time, you know, like maybe half an hour. Okay, so, and the image of the person that I was seeing would periodically open his eyes and look at me. And I was just astounded. I mean, it seemed like there was a real connection. And if I saw this person later, I would recognize this person. But I didn't know this person. Not in my current life. I didn't know this person. And perhaps this person really wasn't relevant to me. Except I was working in hypnosis at the time and had this experience. And if you've had an experience like this, I'd love to hear about it, because you don't read about it too often. Like, I think Jane is really brave, you know, in putting this into her book. And perhaps I'm brave in putting this into my channel here. But, you know, I mean, if you're into this, you'll probably understand. We all have psychic experiences, paranormal experiences, and we try to come to some understanding of them. And often they're really spectacular. So if you're interested in that kind of thing, let me know. Maybe I'll do a video on it. Okay? Thanks. Till soon.